Hello, everyone, and welcome to Northern Spotlights, the talk show that takes you north with the Vancouver Aquarium. My name is Amanda Weltman. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, I am joined by Christine Germano. Hello, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, our pleasure. Christine is pretty amazing. She's the executive director, of the Portraits of Resilience, and it's really great because, well, you're a photographer, that's correct, and she's been able to travel to many places around the world, including different communities up in the Arctic, and you've been able to gain unique experiences through the lens of your camera. Now, I was able to talk with Christine prior to today and got some really cool information and stories. In fact, Christine went on an impromptu seal hunt when you were in Greenland. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
We had just gone for a one-night visit to another community, and it was with the Umanak Children's Home. So there were 12 or 8 or 9 dog sleds anyway. Each dog sled had about 3 or 4 kids and a bunch of dogs. And so, well, on the way back, all the other dog sleds were ahead of me, and my dog sled started to go to the right instead of following the other dog sled. So I was quite worried, and I was trying to figure out what was going on, why were we going this way, and the dog sledder didn't speak English, and he just kept saying to me, "Puisi, puisi," and I was like, what is this? So he stops the dog sled, and he sort of says in Greenlandic, "Okay, you stay here." And he quickly dug a little hole in the ice and tied down the dogs. Then he pulled out his gun and made sort of this little curtain, a white shield, and it's basically for hunting so that the seal can't see him coming. It's just white. So he was like across the ice, and he was pretty far off. He was probably like that big in the distance, and then all of a sudden he shot a seal. But I didn't hear the gun go off because he was so far away. But the dogs did hear the gun, and they're trained that when they hear the gun go off, they basically head for the hunter. They go to him. Only thing was, I was off the dog sled taking pictures with my brand new Nikon and new lens, and all of a sudden I started to see the dog sled started to take off. So I was running with my big, huge Kodiak boots, and I finally caught onto the edge of it, and I dug in my heels to try and stop the dog sled because I didn't know what was going on. And I'm holding on, and then my cuff of my jacket got caught on the arm of the dog sled, and so I started to get dragged behind the dog sled, and there was all this snow going into the lens of my new camera, and I was just like, oh no, there's $5,000 gone. And finally the dog sled stops, and there's the dog sledder looking at me, and he said in Greenlandic, da-da-da-da-da, "You stupid Canadian. I told you to stay on the dog sled." But basically that's what he said in Greenlandic. And so I got up, and while I was getting up and sorting myself out and cleaning off the lens, he quickly went out and got it's like a spear that has a hook on it. He had just missed the top of the seal, so he sort of brazed it, and it went back down the hole, which is not good because it will probably die, and then, it's a waste. So he quickly went in there and he managed to snag the seal, pull it up, and before I knew it, he killed it immediately just by crushing it with the heel of his boot. And it was quite a scene for me. I've never seen anything like that before, and I didn't include those pictures because they're a little too graphic, but the final shot that you'll see is just of sort of the blood on the ice. But I've actually always thought of that image from a conceptual sort of look as sort of the earth bleeding and in regards to climate change and how we treat it. But the punchline to that story was at the pub that night, after they called in someone on the radio, and I lost my seat on the dog sled. It was replaced by the seal. That night at the pub, all the dog sledders saluted me, because you're never supposed to let go of the dog sled ever. But little did they know that I didn't actually hang on. I was dragged because I was stuck. But that was my little secret.
Wow, what a wild ride, and a unique way to kind of get integrated into that community. So it sounds like you've had some really amazing experiences traveling around to these different communities. Where else have you gotten a chance to go visit?
Greenland was 3 or 4 communities: Umanak, Ilulissat, Qaanaaq, and Sorapaluk, which is the most northern community in the world. Teeny little place of about 50, 60 people. Russia, we were in 3 communities right across from Alaska. It's part of Chukotka, Emelin, Cyreniki, Novachapolino. And then Nesseby, Norway, right at the top, and Pangnirtung, Nunavut, obviously, and Shishmaref, Alaska, which is off the Bering Strait.
Now, getting a chance to go to these different communities, do you notice any similarities between them?
There is, there's definitely a lot of similarities. Culturally, the food they eat.
Did you try any of the food?
I did try. I've tried quite a bit of the food. Maktak, the seal skin, which is very chewy. Walrus, I'm not so fond of walrus. Seal meat is probably my favorite, other than caribou. Muskox is a very, very good tasting meat. Whale, I'd rather have that in a stew if I have to. I can't eat fish, so quite often I do end up eating a lot of those other foods. Only once have I tried a tiny little bite of polar bear.
And how was that?
It was really, really strong, very gamey, very chewy. I felt like my body was digesting it for like 3 days. Like you could feel it moving down your intestines.
Interesting.
So I wouldn't recommend eating polar bear. It's not really that tasty. So that was in Greenland.
Yeah.
So I've tried a few.
And in addition to the food, what else do you notice about their cultural similarities?
The artwork, there's a lot of that, similarity of working in the bones or the tusks or whatever is left over after a hunt. One of the most similar things was I actually picked this one up in Norway, and I thought it was really interesting. They use it with reindeer herding, and I was also like that it was kind of like a figure 8 infinity. But as it turns out, not only do the Sami use it for reindeer herding, but they also, all across the Arctic, Russia, Canada, everywhere, Alaska, Nunavut, it's an old way of how they used to hook up the dogs to the dog sled. So everywhere I wore it, people would be like, "Where did you get that?" And I'll be like, "It was Norway." And they'll be like, "Oh," but it's a tool that is used right across the Arctic.
Yeah. That's really neat that you get to go to these places and kind of share all the things that you get a chance to see as well. Now, it sounds like you have gotten so much through your photography. Did you ever think that it would, take you to all these different places?
No, when it was first when I was first asked to do this project by John Crump, and he said, I'd like you to go all over the Arctic and work with youth to get their stories about how climate change affects them. At first, I actually didn't believe him. I was like, oh yeah, sure. And because a lot of people will talk about doing things, but this actually happened. And I think it was 6 months later, I found myself on a plane heading towards Shishmaref, Alaska. So no, I didn't expect it quite to go this direction. But I always know I've done a lot of work with First Nations youth here in Canada, and the photography and writing done by youth is very powerful, and people love to read their stories because they're easy to read. So in some ways I wasn't surprised that the youth project did as well as it did.
So what have you personally learned the most from doing this Portraits of Resilience project?
Oh my gosh. I've learned a lot about climate change, obviously. The permafrost melting, how it affects infrastructure, bridges, buildings, how the melting of the ice is affecting basically the salt in the ocean. That first meter or so off the land is becoming desalinated, that's the word. And so because of that, there's actually a lot of species that are being affected, and they're either moving out or moving deeper. So some animals have even changed what they're eating. And then also, I would also say in Greenland, there's 100 new species that have shown up in Greenland in the last 10 years or so. Wow. Everything from butterflies to birds to even one new seal on the southern tip of Greenland that they never saw before. So there's this huge, that also I've learned that bears are starting to adapt. The polar bear is starting to mate with the grizzly bear, apparently. And it's more of them and their way of adapting they know what's coming, so the animals themselves adapt.
So since starting this project, how has public reception been?
Very good, very excellent. Yeah, people love reading the youth stories, and I think it's just so accessible, and it sort of brings it home, I guess is maybe the best way to say it.
And has it gone further than the Vancouver Aquarium and other galleries?
Well, it opened at the National Museum of Denmark during the climate change talks in Copenhagen. It's been shown in South Africa, the Smithsonian, the Chicago Field Museum, in Norway, Warsaw, the climate change talks. So it's actually been out there quite a bit. This is actually the first real exhibit of the work in Canada.
Oh, nice. Well, I'm glad we get to be a part of that. And you mentioned they got to be a part of the climate change talks. What was that like?
The first time in Copenhagen, it was great. We had a wonderful response from not just the general public, but also the politicians and the scientists. I really enjoyed reading the kids' stories because some of them, they can make their point, their story in a paragraph. And one in particular is the sun rises one day early, and it's from Greenland. And the story is that the sun disappears for 3 months, and it rises on February 4th in Umanak, or at least it used to. And when it shows up that first day, I think it's only visible for a couple minutes, and then it goes back down. So if they welcome the sun, it's actually a celebration. People go over to each other's houses, and the kids make sun masks, and they have a parade. And then all of a sudden one day, it showed up a day early, February 3rd. And I was pretty shocked to hear this. Why? How does this happen? And it's because the Greenlandic ice sheet has melted so much that now it just pops up earlier because there's nothing actually physically in the way.
Wow.
So in some of the communities, it's actually popped up 2 days or 3 days earlier, depending on where they are on that west side of Greenland. So that was something that was very interesting. It was a very local story. And their story was just like one little paragraph long, but it really hit home for people. So, yeah, that was kind of an example of a story. Or the hockey story is another good one.
Could you tell us the hockey story?
The hockey story is upstairs. It's from Nunavut, Canada, and one of my favorites from Johnny Killabuck. And I had just finished telling the grade 12s about the Portraits Project, and I said, so I want all of you to think of what your story idea would be. And Johnny Killabuck was like, whatever, and like put on some earphones, put on some music, and was like, I'm not doing this. And so I walked up to Johnny and I said, Johnny, what's your climate change story? And he was like, what's the point? Why should I bother? Who cares? And I said, well, you must care about something. And he's like, I care about hockey. And I was like, okay, well, has hockey affected, or has hockey been affected by climate change? And he said, yes. We used to start practicing for hockey in November, and now it's not till Christmas. And the hockey season used to last till Easter, but now the ice is melted by March. And that's because the hockey arenas in the north don't have refrigerator units. Because why would they? They just pour the water, open the doors, nature takes its course. But unfortunately, it's literally the ice is melting, 4 to 6 weeks later, or earlier, and it's not freezing later. So his story is about how much playing hockey is so important to them on a social level, on a physical level. He likes to crush people on the ice, okay? And it was very significant because it is much more than just the ice is melting. It's how it affects people, this domino effect. And so he finished up his project first, actually. And he said, well, what do I have to do now? And I was like, that's it, you're done. He's like, what? I said, you're the first finished. And he's like, I've never finished anything first before. I'm like, well, you have now. So we took him to the climate change talks.
Oh, lovely.
And he spoke about his hockey story. And CBC North also showed his hockey story because that's a story that, all Canadians can relate to.
For sure. Well, that's lovely. I do want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your experiences. Quickly, what is next for you?
I'm doing a project with BC Health about gardens, actually. And so that will get started soon. And I'm hoping to do a little bit of work with some First Nations communities up north. And I don't know. And I'm doing a talk at the University of Washington this weekend, actually.
That's great. So it looks like a lot of wonderful things coming for you, Christine.
Thanks.
Thank you so much again for joining us here. And for those of you, if you want to come on down to the Vancouver Aquarium, we have the Portraits of Resilience here for a limited time. But again, thank you so much for joining us. If you want to find out more about Vancouver Aquarium's Arctic commitments, you can visit our website, vanaka.org/OurNorth. Some really great information on there. And tune in on YouTube. You can find more of these Northern Spotlights talk shows as well. So thank you so much, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.